Uh, Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second part of the series, which is much more concerned about the ethics of publication. And so today we will be starting with the what are the regulatory mechanisms are in place for publication ethics. Those who are new or who are planning to write research papers and publish them in peer-reviewed journals should very well be versed with this aspect of publication, because a minor error here and there can create a lot of problems. So we'll try to uh, apprise you of all the issues which are there in international literature regarding publication of a paper and what all needs to be followed. So actually there is no regulatory body or a government agency or an international agency which actually has some kind of a regulation over the ethics of publication. However, there are certain guiding publication ethics bodies which provide recommendations from time to time regarding various aspects of publication ethics, which may be followed, or rather which should be followed. And in fact, most of the international journals, their editors and the peer reviewers, they follow this. The one which is widely respected, regarded and followed is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. There are similar such agencies like Committee on Publication Ethics or World Association of Medical Editors. And even for open access publishing, nowadays there are very strict, stringent ethical guidelines which are proposed by Open Access Scholarly Publishing Association. Now, I'll be briefly touching upon the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors recommendations. A brief word about this ICMJE. What is it? It's a small group of general medical editors, medical journal editors, and representatives of selected related organizations who are working together to improve the quality of medical science and its reporting. It meets annually. It refines its recommendations for the conduct, reporting, editing, and publication of the scholarly work in the medical journals. And this is the most widely accepted recommendations followed word over by most of the scientific journals as of today. The purpose of the recommendations of ICMJE are to review the best practice and the ethical standards in the conduct of the research and its reporting, and also the other material which is published in medical journals. These could be even advertisements. It helps authors, editors, and even others who are involved in peer review process, like peer reviewers, to create and distribute accurate, clear, reproducible, unbiased information to the medical journals. It provides very useful insights into medical editing and publishing process for the media also, which can be also accepted by patients and their families and the general readers of those journals or through media. So actually, who are the sort of stakeholders for these recommendations? It is generally meant in detail for the authors, but they are useful for even editors, peer reviewers, and all the people who are involved in the process of publishing a biomedical journal. So basically, it's a very lengthy recommendation which is put forth by ICMJE in 2017 last. So recommendations are very clear and very elaborate upon defining the role of the authors and the contributors, disclosure of financial and non-financial relationships and activities, and therefore conflicts of interest, responsibilities in the submission and the peer review process. It clearly defines what is the role or the should be the recommendations or the ethics of journal owners and the editorial freedom. Also, it provides guidelines for protection of research participants. It provides general recommendations for editorial issues related to publication in the journal, like corrections, retractions, republications, scientific misconduct, expressions of concern, or retraction of an article. It provides recommendations for copyright, overlapping publications, and also for encouraging correspondence fee, which is charged by the open access journals. It provides recommendations for supplements, theme issues, and special series. It also provides recommendations for sponsorship or partnership for journals which are only publishing in electronic media. It provides recommendations, and also it provides recommendations for advertising and the relationship between the journal editors, journals, and the media person for promotion of an article or the journal itself, and also certain recommendations for journals. To the concept, design of the work, or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data for the work, drafting of the work or revising it critically for important intellectual content, final approval of the version, and agreement to be accountable for all the aspects of the work in ensuring that questions related to the accuracy or integrity, if they arise later on any part of the work, are appropriately investigated, resolved, and replied by the person. Journal provide generally recommendations clearly who could be an author and what is their contribution. So journal generally provide in contents for author or information for authors that what all needs to be required to be of criteria to be fulfilling the authorship. So you must see in which journal you are submitting a paper, whether you are fulfilling the criteria as per the journal standards or not. Journals have a responsibility to investigate any complaint which is received regarding the authorship, because this is the most common sort of conflict of interest which arises in medical science as of today. The journal editors and the reviewers have a responsibility not to covet an authorship of an article which has been submitted to their journal or which has reached a peer review. There are instances when peer reviewer has asked the author to make him one of the author so that he can give favorable comments for that review process and paper may be accepted. This should not be done. It ensures that all the modifications to the author list after publication are justifiable. And if so, then it can issue a correction. Many times authors say that one or two authors have been missed or the names have been having some kind of a typographical error. So these can be corrected as an erratum later on in the subsequent issues of the journal. So journals should encourage authors to disclose their contributions under different subheadings as has been listed here. whether they have provided substantial contribution to the concept or design of the work, or acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data, drafting of the work, or revising it critically for important intellectual content, final approval of the version to be published, and agreement to hold for integrity of the research material provided. So this is basically based on ICMJE guidelines for authorship criteria. And in fact, most of the journals as of today are following this and are asking you, when you are actually sending a paper to the journal, to disclose who has performed what role. Now, people who do not fulfill all the criteria for authorship but have contributed in the research work, they can be listed as contributors. So that is how it should be. Though there is controversy, some of the authors may not agree, but then it is left best to the authors to decide amongst themselves, so that later on a conflict should not arise. Now, many times we do acknowledge people or other uh, societies or bodies. You can do so to acknowledge them, but please do review whether this person qualifies to be an uh, person who can be acknowledged. And if it is an individual, it is always good to get a prior acknowledgement, approval from that person, so that later on some or the other controversy may not arise. There are many other responsibilities of the authors which will be discussed by subsequently by the speakers. Chengappa and then Latika will be talking about predatory journals, and then Dr. Subhash will be talking about informed consent and scientific misconduct being discussed in detail by Dr. Ashish today. Then there are clear-cut responsibilities of the editors and the journal staff. If editors have some or the other kind of a conflict of interest, they should recuse themselves from editorial decisions, and they should clearly disclose it as conflict of interest, so that other editors or associate editors may take up that responsibility. Similarly, peer reviewers who are actually having some kind of a conflict of interest should disclose that and should recuse themselves from doing the peer review process of that particular article. For the editorial staff, it is important that they must not use information gained through working with the manuscripts for their own private gain. And editors are encouraged to regularly publish or disclose statements about potential conflict, their own potential conflicts of interest, as well as their staff's potential conflict of interest. For a supplement issue, when you invite a guest editor, he is also liable to have same kind of norms, nothing different. Then ICMJE clearly provides responsibilities in the submission and the peer review process, defining the authorship principles, as I have told earlier, a declaration of conflict of interest. This will be discussed in detail subsequently, but this is most important part of provided here and can update themselves about it. Briefly, I will be touching upon the ethics of publishing and the editorial issues which come up during the process of publication, like corrections, retractions, republications, and version control. If there is any doubt about the veracity of the publication at any level, or if there is some kind of a conflict of interest, generally it is most commonly it is the authorships, one needs to restore to some of these issues. Either you may retract the article, or you can put an expression of concern, or you can put in a correction. I'll be briefly touching upon these three aspects just to make you a bit clear about it. What is a retraction? Retraction is removing the article from the publication. And this should be considered if there is a clear evidence that findings are unreliable, either as a result of misconduct like data fabrication, or there is an honest error and there has been some kind of a miscalculation or an experimental error, or the findings have previously been published elsewhere without proper cross-referencing, permission, or justification. Generally, it is seen in cases of redundant publication, or there is some kind of a plagiarism which has been reported or pointed out later, or it reports some kind of unethical research which comes up after the publication. Then the article can be retracted. Retractions are generally not appropriate if there is a change in the authorship and there is no reason to doubt the validity of the findings of the uh, results presented in the papers. It can be put in as a correction. Now, expression of concern. Journal editors generally consider issuing an expression of concern if they receive inconclusive evidence of research or publication misconduct by the authors or by somebody else. There is evidence that findings are unreliable, but author's institution or the lab will not investigate the case, or if it is believed that an investigation into an alleged misconduct related to the publication will not be fair or impartial or conclusive, or if there is an investigation which is ongoing but a judgment has not been reached or a final conclusion has not been reached, the journal editors can issue an expression of concern. Also, an expression, if there is a small portion of an otherwise reliable publication proves to be incorrect or misleading because of some genuine honest error, which can always happen, it can be corrected, whether it is pointed out by somebody else or by authors themselves. Then it can be put as erratum in the subsequent issues of the journal. Or if there is some problem with the author or the contributor list and it needs to be corrected, then it can be put in as a correction. So there are three different aspects: retraction, removing of the article, expression of concern. When in doubt, just put a sort of a doubtful value of that paper till the final judgment is reached, and correction, you just put in a erratum so that the readers subsequently can correct themselves whatever misleading or an error information was there in the original article. Now, there are certain guidelines for notice of retraction. This is important. Generally, it should be linked to the retracted article wherever possible in all forms, including electronic versions. It should clearly identify the retracted article, clearly identified as a retraction, and should be published promptly to minimize harmful effects from misleading publications, and should be freely available to all the readers. It may happen that the original article is only available to the people who are having subscription of the journal, but retraction notice should be available free of cost to everyone. And it should also be stated during the process of retraction who is retracting it, whether authors have themselves asked or the journal is retracting the article. And also, very importantly, what is the reason that this article is being retracted? Generally, editors are professionals. They put very professional language while retracting the articles, but any defamatory or libelous statement should not be provided. Now, there are certain aspects of misconduct like duplicate public submission or publication, which will be dealt with subsequently. I will be just only putting forth some observations regarding the acceptable secondary publication. If a study has been conducted and it can be published in two different formats or on two different aspects, then it is acceptable secondary publication. The only thing is that the primary publication should always be referred to. And when you are submitting the article to the journal, in the covering letter, it should be very clearly stated that the original version was published in so and so journal, and this is a secondary version of this particular paper which I am submitting to your journal. Once you are clear in stating that, generally you don't fall into any kind of a conflict later on. Like it may happen that you have done a study for say some biomarker and clinical features, and in the end you notice that the clinical features are conveying at one paper and the biomarker can be in another paper. It can be considered for acceptable secondary publication from the same data set. It is coming from the same data set, but it should not be that you have done the three biomarkers and you publish three different papers naming one biomarker for each paper from that same data set. This is not acceptable. So I've clearly stated this. Once you are mentioning all this information in your covering letter to the editor, I think you are safe and sound, and it will help in making the editors take a decision. Now, editors are generally advised to encourage correspondence, because when people write letters, they put forth some questions which needs to be answered by the authors. So this two-way communication should be encouraged. Journals should very clearly and very transparently provide the charges of publication, per page publication charge, or charges of color pages, or the entire article charge. It should be very clearly stated. It should be stated at a place where it is very easy for the potential authors to see it, so that they can make up their mind before submitting their manuscripts for review. The supplements, theme issues, or special series, they are abide by the same principles as for a regular issue. Now, sponsorship or partnership can be okay, but it should not compromise on the editorial independence. Nowadays, many journals are only published electronically, but they should have a permanent preservation of journal articles on a journal's website or an independent archive or a credible repository, so that the historical record are maintained. Generally, journals can go for advertising, but the policy regarding advertising should be very clear, explicit, and there should be written policies for advertising under the, and these all the guidelines for advertising should be under the strict control of the editors. They should have their final say in advertising, putting forth the advertisement in their journals. Then something about the role of journals and the media. Journals do encourage the dissemination of published articles in their journal, but it should not be a preprint or during the process of submission only that media should be encouraged to discuss those articles. Unless it is coming out in the print, generally the article should not be discussed. And this should be very clear to the authors also. Though the authors may have presented their work in some conferences earlier, they can discuss whatever they have presented in the conferences, but not something beyond that. Lastly, there is very clear guideline that all the clinical trials which are going to be published in any journal should have a registration. And generally, it is for Indian studies, Indian clinical trials, it is the Clinical Trial Registry of India, whereas internationally you have clinicaltrials.gov. Most of the ICMJE member guide journals, they follow a concept of data sharing, so that if required, the data can be shared by the amongst the authors or the person who is requesting it from the author of the original article, and this is encouraged so that valuable information can be sort of shared by potential researchers all over the world. So this is just to give you a very general, very brief, concise review of publication ethics and their regulations. If you really ask me, I'll say that the regulation is at the level of own individual self, be it author, be it editor, be it peer reviewer, or be it the person who are involved in the process of publication. if you are honest to yourself, then the chances of having some kind of a conflict or some kind of a scientific misconduct later on comes very late or should not happen. So with this, I will conclude my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Agarwal. Now we'll move on to authorship do's and don'ts and copyright issues, which will be talked about by Dr. Chengappa.